The Get Rich Slow Club podcast is a collaboration between Tash Etschmann from Tash Invests and Ana Kresina from Perla. The Get Rich Slow Club acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land we record on. From coast to coast, across land, waters, and communities, we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Any advice is general and does not consider your financial situation, needs, or objectives, so consider whether it's appropriate for you.
Welcome to the Get Rich Slow Club podcast,
where we take you from beginner to confident investor.
where we can teach you everything you need to know about investing.
So come get rich slow with us.
Welcome back. Today we are going to dive into all things property with Cate Bakos, the author of The Buy Right Approach to Property Investing, a fully licensed buyer's agent, and a qualified property investment advisor. So many cool titles.
Yeah, there's a handful there, isn't there?
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
But first, we're going to do our money moments. Do you have a money win or a money loss to share with us?
I do have a money win.
Yeah.
I was working with a beautiful couple recently, and they'd had a couple of losses at auction, which can be really disheartening. And a property came along and they were really keen, but the more we delved into it and we looked at pricing and competition, and the agents give you all that kind of intel, it wasn't looking like it would go their way. And I said to them, you know what, it's 3:00 Saturday afternoon auction. Let's just be there. We've done everything else. We're ready to go. And so they were prepped. They were ready to watch it sell to someone else. And I'd already talked to them about the commiseration conversation afterwards. Anyway, the bidding starts. The two buyers I expected to bid didn't. So I'm staring them down. I've positioned myself where I can see them eye to eye. The agents have given me a bit of intel. They weren't bidding. I could tell from the body language once we got to the halftime show, something had happened. They changed their minds, whatever it was. As it turns out, one of them had seen a property that morning that they liked, so it stole the show for them. And the other one, I just don't know why they must have lost their confidence or whatever, because they looked a bit disappointed afterwards. Anyway, we're bidding away. They went inside on my last bid, and it was my last bid, came out, put the property on the market. So there was no need for a nasty pass-in negotiation. We just bought it under the hammer. They couldn't believe it was the best. So the moral of the story is sometimes when there's nothing further to lose, just give it a go.
Yeah, amazing. A few things. What's passed in negotiation? What does that mean?
If the bidding doesn't hit the reserve, the person who holds the highest bid can go inside and negotiate exclusively with the vendor. So the agent will then tell you what the reserve price is. Sometimes they make it up. They'll tell you one that's a bit higher. Other times they'll tell you this is the price that the vendor is prepared to sell it for today. And you can negotiate under that as well. It's obviously a negotiation. Then you just need two parties to agree. Now, if you don't hold the highest bid and it passes in on someone else's bid, or maybe it's a vendor bid, so the auctioneer calls out a bid on behalf of the vendor, then it's open slather. Everyone can have a crack. But if I'm holding the highest bid, then I can go inside. However, when he came outside and said, we're on the market, we're playing for keeps, well, property was ours.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Why don't they tell you the reserve price beforehand?
Oh, Tash, I wish they did. It's one of the world's best kept secrets.
Okay.
And the reason for that is sometimes they'll move the reserve. Sometimes it's not completely bedded down. So when the auctioneer comes out, rings the bell, starts the auction, they've got something in writing at that point. So in Victoria, our legislation states that the vendor doesn't have to declare their reserve until as late as the morning of the auction. So it can happen 5 minutes before the bell rings. But the agreement that they might have is that the agent could go inside for what we call the halftime show. So if you've been to an auction and the bidding slows down or it hasn't started and the auctioneer's out there calling for bids and nothing's happening, people are looking at their feet, they can go inside and say, well, ladies and gentlemen, give us a moment. We're going to consult with the vendor. We'll be back soon. And then when they come back out, usually there's not another halftime show. Occasionally there is, but usually there's not. So a lot can happen at that halftime break. The vendor might say, well, I really wanted 1.2, but things aren't happening out there. If you think it's going to pass in, then why don't you just pass it in and we'll try for 1.3? Or they might say, I know that there's bidders out there and I'm confident it will sell today, but we need to get this auction moving. Why don't you put it on the market at 1.15? So it can be a movable target.
This is so interesting. Did you go to an auction at all for your house, Anna?
No, well, it was during COVID. And so at the time we put in a bid, like we saw a property, I think on a Thursday. We got inspection on a Friday and we put a bid on the Monday.
Amazing.
And they were going to go to auction like in 2 weeks' time. And because we said you have until Wednesday to accept it or not. And so they had to go to a couple other people. And I guess it's called like a blind auction. Like we had the option to do an auction online.
Yes.
Or a blind auction, I guess it's called. Is that what it's called? So
it can be. There's a few different descriptors for that. So what that usually means is put in your best and highest offer.
Yeah. Yeah.
If it's a transparent process, they might be prepared to make phone calls back and forth, although buyers like to see each other when it's transparent. In that case, they'll do what's called a boardroom auction, and that can be via Zoom, or when it's not locked down, it can be in the agent's boardroom. And so that means that you're all on screen, you're all fighting for the prize. It's effectively already on the market because someone like you has triggered an acceptable offer. And people get a little bit weak at the knees about those kinds of processes, and a blind auction can be really hard unless you're already at the top of your limit. And so you're just giving it everything you've got and you're hoping for the best.
Yeah, yeah. So because this is completely different than what we do in Canada. Like there is no auction on the side of the street. Like when I came here and first saw one, I was like, what are they doing? Exactly. And they're like, oh, that's an auction. I was like, you've got to be kidding. Like I thought it was a joke. Like I thought I was like,
oh, wow.
Like 50 people gather for a like to buy. This is so
to spend
weird.
like millions of dollars.
Yeah. It blew my mind. So what we did was a little bit more like the Canadian way, where you put in an offer and then they had to kind of tell the people who were interested that there was an offer, and they all had to put in their highest offer.
Right.
And so we could come back and give a higher offer if we wanted to, because we were the first ones that were able to do the bid.
And that last right of refusal process, that's not widely accepted everywhere.
Oh.
So agents, when it's not an auction scenario, can pretty much make up their own rules. And I don't mean that to sound like they're casual about it. Every agency and every agent has their preference for how they like competitive processes to roll out. And so sometimes they'll say, if you give me the offer first, I'll come back to you last. So that last right of refusal. Other times they'll say, look, whatever you give me, make sure it's your best. And you can fine tune it all you like, but 5 o'clock tomorrow, I want everyone's offers in.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah. Is this why having a buyer's agent is so helpful? Because this seems really stressful.
It is stressful.
For those people who don't know, can you explain what a buyer's agent or advocate actually does?
Yeah, we help with the buying process, and not necessarily just at the pointy end. So sometimes I'll have someone who, like you, would have come along and said, look, we've got this blind auction thing to deal with and we don't know what we're doing. I would then go and assess the property, talk to the agent, get all of the intel, do all of the due diligence, so, find out anything that's impacting that property that you might not know about. So we call council, walk around the neighbourhood, talk to a building and pest inspector. So those things are done in the background before you bid. But there's some of the processes that we help with. And then, of course, there's auction day or there's the negotiation. We take the reins. And buyer's agents also can take a brief and help find a property. And stepping it back a step, we can help people sort out what their brief actually is. Because it's often that I get two people coming to me and they're arguing, they're not on the same page, they don't know what they want.
Yeah.
They've made a mess of it. They're out there looking at stuff all over the place. I've got couples that have been searching all over Melbourne, and I just say to them, no wonder this is going for so long. You think you're opening your options up and you're just confusing yourselves. So a buyer's agent can help with strategy, they can help with the process, they can help with the execution, or all three.
Yeah, I can see the value in that. In Canada, you don't have like these, you do have some open houses, but usually you have a realtor that you go to and they're the ones who show you the property. So when I came here, I'm like, what, that doesn't exist? Or well, it does, like as a buyer's agent, but that's not the norm. I was very blown away with this. So it's always interesting seeing how different countries do it in order to just understand how we do it here in Australia. And from my understanding, it's also slightly different state to state in terms of auctions and so forth. So it can be very confusing.
Do you enjoy buying at auctions?
Yeah, I love it. Okay. Absolutely love it. It's not perfect. It's not the right strategy for every single scenario. Obviously, there's everybody's story is different, but a lot of people fear auctions and they think that properties always fly at auction. And the reality is auctions are underquoted, which is a bit of a shame that it still happens after all of this talk about policing it. I just don't think we're going to see that change unless something changes significantly with our quoting regime. But auctions are underquoted, and a lot of buyers might look at something that's, for example, last night I got a phone call from a client who was having a freak out because they saw a property on Saturday advertised $750 to $820 auction campaign. They sent it over to me. They were really excited. And I said, this one starts with a 9. And they said, no, he spoke to the agent. Anyway, the phone call I got last night was the agent received an acceptable offer of $950. And we've got until 5 o'clock today. So you can imagine, that's why I was up when you messaged me.
Oh, yeah.
It throws you into a spin. You've got to jump into it and do all of that work. So that is very stressful. But if people understood that that property was never worth $750 to $820, it was always worth early to mid-9s, maybe a pinch above, they wouldn't be feeling that going to auction was putting them at a disadvantage if they had a budget like $950. So I think it's a case of understanding your values, and it's easy for me to say that because it doesn't take me very long to assess a property. I can do it in 2 hours. It might take someone a whole weekend. But if it's a $1 million or $600,000 or even $400,000 asset, wouldn't you spend the weekend researching it? Because I would research a holiday if I was spending a tiny fraction of that.
For sure.
I spend so much time looking at holidays, like whole nights on the couch being like, oh, what's the cheapest flight? I know you did this as well. Like, how do you save $10? But with property, people can be like, oh yeah, this is the one. Let's try and buy it and not really look into it as much.
Yeah. And recent comparable sales is not impossible for someone without all of the systems and the subscriptions to do. You literally just have to get on the search engine and look at the sold tab, or if you've got more time to invest, just go around to all of the auctions in the lead up to yours in the suburb that you're looking at and target similar properties and watch how they sell, watch who's bidding, listen to the language and the descriptors that the agents are using, and just pay attention to who's bidding and what sort of prices they're fetching and how they vary. You'll give yourself a really good insight into the likely selling price of what you've got your eye on.
How do we fix underquoting? I've seen that pop up heaps on social media as something that everyone really hates and that it needs to stop. Yeah. Is there a solution to that though?
I think there is. It's not popular across the board, but our regulator needs to grow some and fix it because they don't insist on vendors declaring their reserve price. And I think any vendor has the right to change their reserve all the way to the auction, but it needs to be declared. So if we were making vendors declare their reserve price, we'd know absolutely where the expectation sits. And it might fly over. It might be a really rare special property and 5 people drive it well and truly over the reserve, but at least we know the level that it's on the market at. Because I sit at auctions and help people, and you can see in the crowd, the shoulders slumped, and first home buyers that have just wasted another $600 on a building inspection that didn't even work out for them because they didn't even have the budget when they're on the market. Their budget was below the vendor's reserve price. So it was a total waste of time. Yeah,
that's interesting actually, having to do the inspections beforehand and pay for that, because I guess with other properties you can put an offer in subject to all of those things, but that's not the case at auction, is it?
No.
And it's one key reason why first home buyers are very scared of auctions. A lot of people are, but in particular first home buyers, because they don't want the heartache, they don't want to lose that money, they don't want to bid unconditionally, they don't want to have a loan that is still subject to evaluation and take that risk. And I have to talk people through that dilemma every single week, because a lot of people will say to me, we've done all of this due diligence, you've given us your pricing analysis, we're going to auction, but what if the price tag isn't agreeable to the bank? And I have to say to them, it's a very rare thing for that to strike. And I can tell you when I think that your limit is above where its value sits. And sometimes I'll say to people, we're now in premium price territory. Are you okay with that? And if we get a valuation shortfall, so if the bank valuation comes in below the price tag that you've paid, can you cover the differential? Because that's the scenario that they're facing.
Does that happen often?
It hasn't happened often to me.
Okay.
The one time it did happen, I absolutely knew that it would. I was very confident that it would. And I said to the clients, I know you really want this property and you've got an emotional reason to go hard for it. And the price tag that you've given me is $100,000 over where I think a valuer will agree. Are you prepared for that? And they absolutely were.
Okay.
It's so discouraging when you go somewhere and you're like, I've given it all, I have my budget, and it goes over hundreds of thousands of dollars. Because that's happened when we were looking for our property. And one of the biggest things was, why is it said that this is the price and it's hundreds of K over that? It's so hard.
It's really hard. Yeah. It's a bit devastating, especially when the agents haven't handled that well and it's misleading. When you have a property that's super popular, and it might be scarce in all the right ways. I mean, there's scarce in the wrong ways. They're the ones that don't sell. But the ones that are scarce because they've got the perfect floor plan, they're in a beautiful street, they're easy amenity to everything, north facing, superbly done, great proportions with the yard space and the internals. Those are all the things tick, tick, tick. You can expect it will fly. And so the only thing that you can say to people is we've got to find you another one. But if the winning bidder has had to pay a premium to get something like that, I guess the thing that they can remind themselves of is when it's their turn to sell, they'll be facing a similar scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those are really great tips in terms of what you should look for a property, because that was something I was always like, north facing, you know,
What
something
is
that was
north
important.
facing? Is that a Melbourne thing or an everywhere thing?
It's a Southern Hemisphere thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was funny. The first time I was chatting to an English buyer years ago, she was really freaking out about my whole north-facing thing, and it took a while for the penny to drop. But it essentially means that throughout any of the seasons, you're getting optimal sunlight to your house.
Oh, okay.
Because east is morning sun, west is afternoon sun, south you don't get a lot of sun.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got a south-facing rear and you haven't got any northerly light through, whether it's clerestory windows or courtyards or whatever, that house might feel dark and colder. And for some people that's psychologically not comfortable for them. So, you know, I occasionally get the brief where someone says, I have to have natural light. I get really blue in the winter.
I'm like that. I hate when it's too dark. Like I love having all the windows and big balconies.
You definitely feel it in Melbourne. Like in Melbourne, you definitely feel it, because I had an apartment that was, I think, south facing, and you're just like, oh my gosh, you never get sunlight.
That's right. And you get things like rising damp and mold. It's a higher chance of having it in a damp south-facing building.
All these things to remember. Going back to what your book is called, The Buying Right Approach to Property, is that exactly it?
Buy right?
Yeah.
Yes.
What is that approach? Do you have a few steps for us?
We do. And I thought about this. I don't so much have a checklist. There's a lot of information in the book about what we don't buy. And so it's a bit of a John West principle, that ad John West.
I don't know.
John West is the brand that has canned fish.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, it's the fish that John West rejects that makes John West the best. That's their
Have
saying.
you had that, Anna?
No, I haven't.
Yeah.
So I have to Google that ad after.
You will.
Yeah.
In the world of property, it's a lot like that. We reject a lot of properties. And so I can be searching the search engine for a client search. We have on markets, off markets, pre-markets. A lot of people know what they mean. They're the properties that aren't on the market or aren't on the internet. But the ones that are on the internet, I could be scanning through them. It's around 2% that catch my eye. 98% I whiz past.
What catches your eye?
Something that's not on a main road.
Yes, yeah.
Something that doesn't look like it's got the wrong zoning.
What's wrong zoning mean?
If you're looking for an apartment, ideally you want it to be residentially zoned. And you can't physically see the zoning when you go to the property. You can only see it when you look at the contract of sale or look it up on a planning portal. And if the zoning that the property sits within is resi, highest and best use, the bank will say yes to most loans if you qualify for a loan. They won't knock back the property on the basis of its zoning. Now, if the zoning for an apartment is mixed use here in Victoria, that means that there's a planning rule that enables the property to have both office, residential, shops. And so mixed use is tolerated because there's an acceptance that there's a residential property there. And if it's not those zones, it might be activity zone or capital city zone or dockland zone. Those are zones that the banks will accept. And your loan to value ratio, so how much deposit you're putting in and how much you're borrowing, can vary between zones. So resi, if you really need to borrow, let's say 95%, you'll probably be able to with a residentially zoned apartment. If it's mixed use, you might not be. You might be restricted to a bit less.
That's so interesting. I didn't know it varied like that.
Does.
That's crazy.
But there's a couple that we avoid. So commercially zoned properties, it's very hard to use your residential property pre-approval for a commercially zoned property. In fact, the bank can say no. And if you can't use your pre-approval and go through a residential loan, but you qualify for a commercial loan, we've got to remember the difference between resi and commercial lending. Residential has lower interest rates, commercial is higher. Residential lets you repay the debt over a 30-year period, and commercial is 15. And you also need a much more significant deposit for commercial. So what that means is it puts your monthly repayments into a much higher bracket. And from an affordability or servicing point of view, the bank might say you don't actually service it. We can't say that you can demonstrate that you can afford it. So I've seen people purchase commercially zoned apartments thinking that they're resi, and they've lost their deposit because they haven't been able to get lending.
Oh no, that's horrible.
It's awful. It's a nightmare. And there's the odd industrial property that looks like a house.
Yeah, I have a friend who was in a very similar situation. So as you're talking about this, I'm like, oh, this makes sense. I remember the challenges around that, not realizing that it was I guess, commercially zoned.
Yes.
Or, yeah.
This feels like such a Melbourne thing. Like I can't think of a spot in Perth, but then I think of like this suburb we're in, like South Yarra, Prahran, Toorak. Toorak, is that how you say it?
Toorak.
Yeah. Like they're all, you see all the apartments above like commercial places, I guess.
That's right. If there's a shop underneath, warning bells. So when I'm looking on the internet, back to your first question, what am I tossing aside? Anything above a shop.
I used to live above a shop, and
you were south facing. You've got all the negatives.
Yeah, I was looking at like what it went for, and I was like, I would never pay that much money. And it was on a busy road, and
so no busy roads. We want north facing. We don't want it to be above a shop.
Yes.
What else?
We want it to be a certain size. So if it's an apartment, it can't be under 50 square metres. The banks don't like it. So my rule of thumb is I don't like what the banks don't like. Because you don't want that drama. And even if you do get it across the line, if you find some random lender that says yes, or some lender that allows you to have your commercially zoned apartment as a residential security, you can't guarantee that that will happen next time that property transacts. So if you're trying to sell it and you've had all of these dramas, well, you'll be casting your mind back to when you had the nightmares, and that's the product that you're then trying to sell. So it does impact your ability to get a good price.
Yeah, and you want to be able to refinance as well. You'd hate to be stuck with that same random lender.
That's right. The other things that I look for, so it's not all about apartments. Sometimes it's about houses. I look for proportionality. You don't want a house that used to be a 2-bedroom house with a great dining room and a living room that's been transformed into a 3-bedroom house. Living area now too tight because you've created a family home, but there's not enough room for the family.
Yes.
Or someone might have done a really cool extension, but they've now got a 4-bed, 2-bath, 2-car house with really minimal backyard. So you've got to think about the needs of what you're creating it for. If you've taken a small little terrace and created a family home, but there's insufficient living space or backyard, or if you've changed the property so that there's no off-street car parking and the streets chock-a-block with cars.
Yep.
Anything that could put a buyer off buying it, they're the things that I look for and avoid.
That bit about houses versus apartments, that's a bit of a heated topic. I bought an apartment and then I rented it out, and it's done quite well for me. It's not like a big building. It's just like a boutique block where there's no real other apartments around it. So I think it's done quite well for that reason. What's your thoughts on buying an apartment as an investment?
I would absolutely rinse and repeat what you did, Tash.
Okay.
Clever.
Okay.
Very clever. So boutique apartments, there's not a magic number. Everyone has numbers like 12 or 10 or 20 or 8. As long as it doesn't have lifts.
Yeah, mine doesn't have a lift.
Yeah.
It doesn't have like any amenities. So it's kind of like the strata fees are really low. They're $400 a quarter, which is amazing.
That's great.
Yeah, and they're mostly still owner-occupiers, everyone who lives there, which is great. There's only mine and one others that's rented out, which is awesome.
That's as ideal as it gets. And you mentioned a street that didn't have lots of other apartments.
Yeah, it's the only apartments in that suburb.
How amazing.
Yes, so that worked out well, luckily.
It would, because you tend to find with apartments, you might have 2 cars per apartment if you've got couples living there or house sharers. And so, of course, a lot of these apartments only have 1 car space on title. So if you've got a block of 10 apartments, you might have 10 extra cars in the street. Now, if you've got apartment blocks next door to yours, the street gets pretty busy pretty quickly.
Yeah, they did well with their visitor car parks, which I liked. There's like 5 visitor ones plus there's street parking, which is really awesome. Because I hated that so much, where you get somewhere and you can't find a car park. Like I would hate to do that every single day.
Well, you did well. And I think applying all of the things that would give you the irrits and making sure you weren't buying into that was really smart.
I'm not sure where it's facing though. I'll have to double check. But it's got windows on either side, so it gets sunlight.
Okay. Well, north is great, but there's nothing wrong with east and west as well. Sometimes with westerly, you might need good shade sails or covers or whatever, because it can get a little bit sticky.
No, I think it's west because it's like, parallel to the ocean. Yeah, and it's in WA. So yeah.
Perfect.
Oh, figured it out.
You get to watch the sunset. Like,
no, not properly. Kind of, yeah. There's just like lots of trees because it's like kind of like a straight back off the main road. So they've got like this big tree thing that blocks from what you can see.
Because in Vancouver, the ocean is on your west and the sun sets on that. And so I had a view in my apartment there. So I always think of like Perth being like my Vancouver because it's West Coast, right?
Like
go to the beach, the sun goes down on the ocean, which is very different than watching a sunrise like in Byron, right?
Oh, well, that sounds lovely.
All beautiful, though. I wish we all had apartments on the beach, right?
Yes. I like that we've sorted the apartments aren't always a terrible investment one.
Not at all. In fact, Melbourne has underperformed in the apartment stakes for such a long time. That disparity is so wide. And I'm seeing a huge take up at the moment in apartments. And if you've had a look at the CoreLogic data lately, for the first time in as long as I can remember professionally in this industry, we've seen units outpace houses.
I've seen that happening in a few different places at the moment,
Yeah.
like Perth as well. It's been crazy
That's
to watch.
right.
Yeah.
It's not just Melbourne. It's actually everywhere except Hobart. And there was one other, might be Darwin.
Tasmania or something?
Yeah. Yeah, it was Hobart and Darwin.
Hobart.
So the reason for that, there are a few reasons, but it comes down to affordability at the moment. So people are looking at smaller budgets because interest rates have gone up and they've squeezed our borrowing capacity. We've also seen investors return to the market in certain capitals. And because investors are facing higher interest rates as well, they're looking for much stronger rental yields. And you get a stronger rental yield on a unit than you do on a house typically.
Why is that?
Tenants rent the dwelling, not the land. So you might get a 2-bedroom apartment and contrast that next to a 2-bedroom terrace. And when you measure the floor plan, there won't be much difference, except the terrace sits on more land. And so the tenant will pay a very similar price to, for a good renovated 2-bedroom property.
But it's more expensive to buy the
That's
terrace.
right.
Yeah, it makes total sense.
Exactly.
So these are really great tips for a first home buyer, I think, in a lot of cases who want to maybe purchase an apartment or a property. Do you have any other tips for first-time home buyers? Because I'm also very curious to hear people who do have property and are thinking of buying a second property.
Yes.
What's the differences in advice or things that you would look for?
I've got so much advice for first home buyers. I just love seeing people get a foot on the property ladder. I think it's important. And I'd say to them, first and foremost, if you've decided that you'd like to build your own future wealth through property, it's not a dirty word. There will be people that give you a bit of a hard time.
Interesting one. Why is it not a dirty word?
Because looking after yourself in retirement is taking the burden off the state or off the federal government. Because if you're wealthy enough to look after yourself, you won't be qualifying for a pension and you'll be in a position to be able to help others, because you do tend to find that it's intergenerational as well. If people are wealthy enough to be able to help their children, whether it's with equity or gifted funds or whatever. And so as much as we've got a force out there that is suggesting, it's greedy and not fair if someone owns more than one property or doesn't live in the property that they own, I look at it from the point of view of investment. And we don't really give people who are invested in shares the same kind of hard time.
I've got so much to say on this bit. I've been researching, looking into the data of why there's a housing crisis and seeing how few homes we're building compared to what we need. The government saying we need 1.2 million homes by 2029, but we're only building, was it 170,000 homes
That's right.
last year?
Yes.
We're missing, 50 to 60, even 70,000 homes each year. So no matter if you remove capital gains or negative gearing discounts, it doesn't really matter if there's still not enough homes.
It's a really interesting point, Tash. And I look at how much the removal of negative gearing could impact the housing crisis when we consider how many people are actually multi-property investors. It's a very, very small percentage. And what people don't talk about is the number of private investors that own rented properties in Australia. So we've got the government who own social housing, and then we've got some small not-for-profit groups that contribute to social housing and affordable housing, and then we call them mum and dad investors, and I've had people get upset about even that term, but let's just say private investors. They're Aussies that own property. And it's 91% of all rental properties are owned by Aussies that own properties.
Yeah.
And 9% that are owned by the government and by other not-for-profits. And so the issue that we have is if we disincentivise that 91% and we see investors dropping out of property ownership, it will really start to hurt our supply. So we can talk about new builds, but we're not actually looking after existing rental property owners when we're disincentivising them.
And the gender stats are really wild as well. I was reading between the age of 18 to 29, 50% of males own property, but only 25% of females,
Yes.
which is crazy when you think about you need the time for your investment to compound, and if females are starting so much later.
Yeah.
Then there's the other end where the group that's most at risk of homelessness is females over 50 or 55.
That's right. Yes.
And then I think if females are more empathetic, it's harder if this messaging is landlords are evil, you shouldn't invest in property. Where does that leave everyone else?
I think it's a really dangerous rhetoric, and I do feel that it will turn when the pain starts to get worse. I mean, it will amplify because we're losing a lot of investors, particularly in Victoria. Our investor-led sales are enormous at the moment, and we've had rental reforms and some of them are really onerous, some of them are great. And I saw just this morning in the news feed, now we're mandating air conditioning units, and I think it's great to have a cool unit in summer. But we've also got to think about the landlords that are struggling at the moment with heightened repayments and other associated costs and the land tax. A $3,000 belt could really hurt someone and trigger that decision to sell. So I think it has to be weighed up really carefully how we do this. And if there was some kind of incentive or opportunity for landlords to get some government assistance to put in air conditioning units, I would have felt a bit better about the policy, to be honest.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I saw the campaign by the Greens, I think it was, saying that everyone should have heating in their homes because it's unfair to be able to have to pay for like an external heater or something like that. But then the people who buy or put heaters in, you still have to pay for the electricity bill. So it seemed like they were kind of covering one side of the messaging, but not really addressing that electricity is still unaffordable or gas is still unaffordable for a lot.
That's right. Yeah, we've got a lot of policies that have unintended consequences at the moment.
I feel all of this. I can't even believe how cold houses can get here in Australia, just talking about the heating and or like especially in Melbourne, I couldn't believe that. So it's so hard because it's important for the government to kind of mandate some of these things, because you do want to have tenants who are looked after, but you also want your landlords to be looked after, right? It's a mutual kind of beneficial situation if we can create laws and around that stuff.
Yeah, I agree. It's a tough one because we're not about to see legislation change to favour a landlord. There's no way that will happen. And I think back to the lockdown period when all of that was so horrible and so unknown, and tenants were in distress and people had lost their jobs or weren't earning, and then JobKeeper kicked into gear, and we had a lot of landlords having to just cut deals with the tenants because that was the messaging that we got from the government. The Morrison government said, we're not getting involved, you have to just work this out with your tenant. And then Melbourne had eviction moratoriums put in place and we just had to work it out. Some landlords offered significant discounts that weren't repayable, some offered repayable, and it felt like it was quite rogue at the time. And now we're paying this temporary tax because of the state government spend, and that's coming through in the way of extra land tax for the next 10 years. And I do wonder, what about the other investors? Why aren't the government targeting other asset classes? And where were they when the investors really needed them during that time when the mortgages had to be paid? And it was quite messy.
That's such a good point about not targeting people who own shares. Do you think that's because of super and them not wanting to affect super?
Yeah, there's a bit of that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think they look at the voting base.
And what's popular to hate on at the moment, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Why isn't, like everyone keeps saying, not everyone, but on Instagram I often see people say landlords should just sell their properties and the housing crisis would be fixed. I think there's a few reasons why that's not true.
There are. So I remember when we had a lot of vacant apartments and we also had a lot of apartments on the market in Melbourne, particularly through lockdown, and some of them were poorly orientated and poorly sized and just poorly located apartments. They were D-grade apartments in my view, but there were a lot on the market. And when we look at stock levels, we can look at days on market and you can look at new listings and old listings and total listings. Now, an old listing is a property that's been floating around for more than 180 days on the market.
Wow.
And
that feels like a long time.
It is a long time. Yeah. And we had a lot of those in Melbourne and they tended to be the apartments. And I just remember thinking, my goodness, that's a huge amount of apartments. And then when lockdown eased and a lot of people had moved away to the regions or the coast, the country, and all of a sudden life is coming back in Melbourne. It's a bit more fun. We've got venues on again. The city started to feel nice. And so I saw a few people wanting to get back into the city, but they didn't want to let go of their country pad. And so the instruction that I had was find us a bolt hole in the city. So that the first time that started was at the very end of lockdowns when Melbourne was coming back to life. And then we saw another wave of those types of buyers when the major employers all started saying, come back to the office, especially the big banks and, your city dweller businesses. And we then saw a wave of people who were retaining their country home and getting their piece of paradise in the city. And interestingly, they were buying this old stock that had been floating around and all of a sudden we saw apartment prices uplifting. My point is they weren't going to first home buyers. They were going to second dwelling buyers. And we've seen a lot of that over the last 2 years. And so the concept of give up your house so that someone can get into the property market, it's a bit of a furphy, and I'd love them to run the stats and actually have a look at who's buying. because it's not necessarily creating another roof over someone's head. In a lot of cases, it's giving someone a second home option.
Interesting.
I'm always fascinated by like the rules in place. Like in Vancouver, if you have a second home, you have to pay like an additional tax. So if you have a beach house or if you have a place in the mountains. So it's interesting to see what's happened in other places where similar supply and demand issues are in play and how that kind of affects an economy. So I'm always curious to see what's going to happen here in Australia and Melbourne in different areas.
Well, land tax is certainly that kind of tax. The question is how much harder can they push it? We've got vacancy tax. We've got tax for foreign buyers, and we've obviously got a heightened tax now in Victoria to help deal with the budget that was overblown during lockdown by the Victorian state government. So I just don't know how much more they can tax investors and second dwelling owners. And I guess if it's a second dwelling owner, people could say that it's not a bad thing if someone lets go of their holiday house or their bolt hole in the city. But ultimately they've worked hard for that and paid for that, and how they use it and enjoy it is really up to them.
Well, it also just depends on what levers you use, right? Like I think of being a first home buyer, like stamp duty is not a thing back home. And how huge is that if that's a huge percentage of your down payment, right? Like that's a stamp duty. And if you're a first time home buyer, that makes it almost really difficult to get into the property market as well, especially if you're maybe looking to upgrade later again. It's another amount of money that just kind of disappears in a way.
Yes.
It's almost de-incentivizes people from actually selling and purchasing, like getting in and out, or whether it's a first home or whether you're upgrading even, right?
It's interesting that you said that, because there's this old, well-known kind of thought or thinking that people change their home roughly every 7 years in Australia, and that's blown out now. It's closer to 11 years. And part of the reason for that is the cost of upgrading or downsizing. The stamp duty has become enormous because it's always been a fixed percent. Well, it's a scaled percentage, but it's a really big figure now. And the one thing I would say to first home buyers is get out there and have a look at everything that you qualify for to help with the burden of getting onto the property ladder. So whether it be stamp duty concessions or the deposit guarantee, which I think is an awesome system, I really do. That means you don't have to save the full 20% to avoid lender's mortgage insurance. If you qualify, the government will basically underwrite that risk for you, so you don't need to get that insurance, and you can get onto the property ladder for as little as a 5% deposit. So there are limitations to all of these things, and in particular the stamp duty. It cuts off at $750,000, but at $600,000 or under, it's zero. And between a $600,000 and $750,000 purchase, it's a sliding scale. So I'd say to anyone, take advantage of that. It's there for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did that with mine and it was great. I didn't pay stamp duty and I got the $10,000 first home buyer's grant.
Yay.
Yeah, that was great. That was fun.
Yeah, well played.
Yes. I've got some questions from our Instagram and Facebook community. Yeah. The first one was just lots of praise for you. Not a question, but Cate is so good. You've got lots of fans.
Thank you.
The next one, this is kind of a bit personal but interesting. Brand new house, 6 months old. Now I'm filing for divorce. Should I keep or sell in this market?
Oh, wow. This is a really hard one, and I'll speak from the heart. When you're divorcing, sometimes you need what's familiar around you and what you love to comfort you and get you through that. Other times you just want to start afresh.
Yeah, I don't want to look at it ever again.
Yeah, and you've got to tap into what's going to work for you, because this is an enormous time for this listener, and that road is really difficult, and they'll come out the other end and have some really important stories to impart and things to help other people going through this one day. But in the meantime, I wouldn't be too focused on the financial implications of navigating a divorce. If you find comfort in the property and you love it, then you should stay in it and do what you can to get on your feet. Obviously, if you're looking at selling something that's brand new, because the dwelling is so new, it will have depreciated quite a bit in that short space of time, you might not get what you paid for it. And that can be upsetting. It can be quite distressing. If facing that is something that could really unravel you and make things unbearable, then get some appraisals done before you go triggering a sale, so that you know what sort of losses you could be dealing with. But ultimately, if just breaking away and moving on and dealing with the financial loss is something that you'd prefer to face, then just get some accounting advice before you sign a contract, so that you know how you can carry forward losses and deal with this.
That's a really good answer.
Divorce is really hard. I went through it, and you want to move on.
So another question. with the public push to change or remove negative gearing, is property still worth investing in?
It's a really good question. The closest I felt that we've been to negative gearing in my time as an advocate was in the run-up to the 2019 election with Bill Shorten proposing that they'd scrap negative gearing for established properties and only keep it for brand new. And that would have been a game changer if that had gone through, not necessarily for the right reasons, but it would have meant that a lot of investors were then turning to brand new, which is not the best performer. And there's a reason for that. We'll talk about it soon. But since then, I think that a lot of politicians and political parties will be very nervous about toying with negative gearing. And it was toyed with before I was an advocate, and it was eventually reversed after around 6 months. It was a bit of a mess at the time. So I think that while it is a conversation topic that's on the table, I don't see it happening, at least not in this climate.
I remember that election. We were looking for property at that time, and there was such little property on the market. And a big reason was I think people were worried about negative gearing being taken away.
Yeah, it was a hard time. And nationally, all of our property growth figures dropped at that time. And then when the election provided us with that surprise win, it took off again, and then it slowed down again with COVID hitting our shores. And I'd never seen such a roller coaster ride with property values soaring and plateauing. It was horrible.
It's crazy how politics affect property markets so intensely.
Yeah.
Government intervention, it would surprise you how many markets have surged and dipped because of government tinkering with things.
You said something about new properties not being as profitable. Why is that?
There's a concept called land to asset ratio. So if we I'll keep it simple to start with. Think of a house on its own piece of land. There's two elements to that property's value. You've got the value of the dwelling and the value of the land. If the dwelling is over 40 years old and it's been depreciating for all of its life, it won't be worth very much. And so the land to asset ratio for an old house that's really rugged is probably above 90%, which means that the investor has fantastic opportunity for capital growth because it's land that grows. However, if it's a 95% land to asset ratio, as an investor, they're probably going to get lots of maintenance call-outs, so that property will do their head in. And then if they look at a brand new property, the land to asset ratio might only be 40% because they've paid not very much for a cheap piece of land out in the fringe, and they've had a building constructed and it's brand new. It's a bit like a car. When you drive it out of the lot, it depreciates as soon as you turn the key. So that's the issue with a brand new property, and you tend to find that some house and land package type properties might hover around that 40 or 50, if you're lucky 60%. Often it's under 50 though, which means that the dwelling will depreciate at a faster rate than the land will appreciate. So for the first few years, that property might be losing value.
Okay, so you've got to hold it longer term then.
You do. And when it comes to a high-rise property, it can be even harder because you've got a tiny percentage that you don't own a piece of land outright, but there might be 400 or 200 properties in that block. And the land, while it's valuable, you're only essentially owning a 1/200th share. And so you tend to find that an off-the-plan or a brand new high-rise apartment, it could be as low as 30% or even less. And so they tend to lose value. And you'll often see in history, when you check out the sales history for a given property, it cost more when it was bought off the plan than when it was sold for the next one or two transactions.
I'm getting flashbacks to when I was looking at property and thinking the exact same thing in terms of land to asset ratio. Oh my gosh. I'm actually surprised how much I know from
good.
No, well, I'm just in my head, not just from doing the research. Yeah, because property is a lot to think about. And that's why I think it is so valuable to have someone like a buyer's advocate who knows all that stuff, because it is a lot to consider, a lot of research. Where are you buying? What kind of property? What are you planning on doing with it? It's a lot to overcome. If you have one tip for anyone who's looking to get into property, what would be the one tip that you think is important?
Yeah, I'd say researching it in a nice way. You don't need to go and study it, but talking to Uncle Bob at a barbecue isn't enough. If you're talking to other people, you've got to make sure that they know what they're talking about. They've either done it successfully themselves or they're in the industry and they're actively doing it. There are lots of people in the industry who aren't actively doing it, but put the research in. So whether it's tuning into some podcasts, getting some books, all of the above,
Reading some books. What's your book? Should we buy your book?
I'd love you to. The Buy Right approach to property investing is something that I co-wrote with Pete Wargent, who I think is a bit of a genius in his own right. I love Pete.
And Pete's a mortgage broker, is that right?
No, Pete's he owns a business in Brisbane that also does buyers advocacy. But Pete's he's across global markets. He spends half of his time over in the UK and then the other half here. He's an Englishman himself, and he studies the markets, and he talks about not just the property market but the share market and equities. His economics knowledge is astounding. It's great. And I've always loved talking to Pete because I can get him to translate what's happening at the coalface into theory. And we've been able to match up our stories and create some really good insights around, what's been happening in property for the time that we've been active investors. And what we've got in common is we do both have a property portfolio, and Pete was able to look at retiring when he was in his early 30s.
Wow.
So, he's this guy that wears board shorts and enjoys surfing and playing cricket and writes. He takes his laptop everywhere and he does a daily blog. So he's very intelligent, he's very tuned in, and he's just got great commentary. And I love the way his mind works. So it was a real buzz to write a book together. But the book aims to simplify some of the jargon and create some real life stories that people can relate to and give people some firm ideas of what to avoid and how you can get rich slow.
I haven't, and very nice. I haven't finished it just yet, but it's been really interesting. I loved your personal stories at the start, and hearing you came from chemistry to now working in property, that's amazing. But I definitely recommend it's a very good book.
Oh, thanks, Tash. I appreciate that.
If people want to find out more about you or use you do you take on buyers advocate clients still?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
how can people find more about you?
All that I do. My website is catebakos.com.au. My name is Kate with a C. And Pete and I have an interview series out that people can have a listen to if they want to have a look at Buy Right Property Book. We've got a Facebook group, and we've also both got a bit of information about the book on our individual websites.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. This was such a fun chat.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Kate.
Thanks so much for joining us. If you found this episode helpful, please rate us 5 stars, write a review, or share with a friend. If you're new to investing, make sure to listen to our first 10 episodes. Follow us at Get Rich Slow Club or Tash at Tash Invests or me at Ana Kresina.
This show was brought to you by Natasha Etschmann, who is an authorised representative, 1299881 of Guideway Financial Services, AFSL 420367, and Perla, who is an authorised representative, 1281540 of Sanlam Private Wealth, AFSL 337927. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to investing. So make sure you check out our financial services guides and read the product disclosure statement and target market determination for any investments you're considering. See our show notes for more info.